And you mentioned there about women in motorsport, and it's something we wanted to touch on. And there's a lot going on at the moment. There's the more than equal stuff that Coulthard and Kate Bevan are involved with. We've had W Series come and probably go. We've got the new Formula One Academy that's launching soon. There are things happening, but do you think, both of you, do you think we're doing enough for women in motorsport? And then second part of the question, does Jamie Chadwick deserve a shot at F1?
I'll go with the second part of the question first, just because it's a bit easier to answer and quicker to answer, is that she might, but she's still so far down the ladder to be able to make that call. I mean, going into Indy Lights, or Indy Next as they're now calling it, I'd still like, it's a good category, but it would have been like her going into Formula 3. And there's not a driver in heading into what would be their rookie Formula 3 season next year that I'd say they deserve to be an F1. They might in the future. They can maybe prove themselves. Similarly, the way Nick de Vries has gone around getting to Formula 1, when he came out of Formula 2, I didn't think he was ready for an F1 seat, or kind of, I wasn't that gutted that he didn't get one. I kind of thought, I don't know if he really shines enough to get ahead of anyone else on the grid right now. But what he's done since, and the more rounded driver he's become at a much later age into his mid-late 20s, then yeah, absolutely deserving. So I think that could be potentially in future. I certainly don't think it should be that people try and judge her now. I think it's a bit too unfair to do it with what she's had in terms of experience. But I don't think motorsport in general, and certainly not single-seater junior categories of motorsport, are doing anywhere near enough. And it's great that more are doing it now. But what really annoyed me on this front was the discussion around the F1 category that they've put together, because people were saying, they should have just helped W Series. They should just give money to W Series. It was already there. And it's like, why do people think that all it needs is one single category to try and help a group of probably 18 female drivers, and that will fix the problem? How many young men get to go racing and have opportunities and seats in cars that that suit them, fit them, are designed for them? Because that's another thing, kind of like the physiological differences mean that there's a lot of cockpits that just are not kind of compatible for women to have, and we're only talking small things, but motorsport is done in small details. The differences are, especially in spec series that then have differences in teams and what they can produce, you are looking for the smallest gain. And if just not being comfortable in the car or able to do certain things in the car, like, it's such a big disadvantage. But then to say, okay, as long as one category is trying to change that, you're at best going to get maybe one standout driver from that group of 18, which would be a hell of a hit rate to have one standout driver from such a small pool, that then has to step up to a category full of much more experienced and well-prepared male drivers and say, go on, shine. And when they don't, go, oh, well, it proves they can't do it, and that category is not good enough to supply them. It's the complete wrong mindset. What we need is to try and find a way of making it as many opportunities to get as many women in cars as possible, and then make sure that doesn't get too high up the ladder so you don't segregate all the way up, and that they can then step into something like Formula 3 or even at Formula 2 level, and you've got 3, 4, 5 women that are more than capable of going in there. And if one of them does well, then they're going to be maybe winning a championship at F3 and F2. They're going to get to F1. But there feels like they're just looking for one Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen-esque figure. Like, how rare are they, even when you've got thousands and thousands of men doing it? And then from that point, it's like, well, then what happens afterwards? And I think Jess maybe speaks a bit better about this than I do. But just getting one female driver into an F1 car for one race, are people going to view it as, oh, good, job done? Like, what happens next? So
yeah, but it's an education thing, isn't it? Because that's very articulately put, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything you've just said. The trouble is, you jump onto Twitter or LinkedIn and you see the name Jamie Chadwick or Alice Powell, even, or there's a few at that kind of level. And the chat on Twitter is, why isn't she in an F1 seat? She should be in an F1 seat. Why hasn't this happened yet? There's nobody outside of people in the industry who are giving that balanced view. It just feels like, just stick her in a car and then, job done.
I think that's to do with, again, maybe going a bit macro here, but there's this societal need for instantaneous change, as in, like, it just needs to happen now. Like, W Series has failed because it hasn't produced a F1 driver. And it's like, well, that's not actually how it works. We're trying to repair decades, if not, this motorsport came about from rich men racing around in cars. It was like, it wasn't even really a proper I'm going to get killed for saying this. It wasn't like a proper sport. It was genuinely just something for them to do on the weekends, right? You would buy a car, you'd take it racing, and then all of a sudden it became this more nuanced thing of, oh, actually, you know, this could turn into a proper thing and we could run it professionally. And then you got like the bodies, the governing bodies are kind of emerging, and it became a proper outfit. But, you know, it was never meant or made with female racing drivers in mind. And so what we're trying to do here is kind of take it back to basics, which is what I think I and Chris and I have had many a debate around this topic. Obviously, I have a slightly different viewpoint on certain things, but I think for the most part we agree in that it's not going back far enough. It's not like, you know, we're setting up a series for junior racing drivers, but they're still like fairly old in comparison to who they would then be going up against in terms of when they were meant to go back from the segregated series into a mixed series. And they also have a lot less seat time because W Series only races X number of times a year. And if you like, you know, I know Jamie Chadwick had been able to, probably primarily through the funding that she's won through W Series and obviously certain backers, to be able to arrange private testing. But for the most part, those girls can't do that. And so if we're going to compare apple and oranges, like you're talking about drivers that have had so much more single-seater seat time competing against these female drivers. And I really hate using the term female drivers, but here we are. I guess we do need to kind of differentiate if we're going to be talking about this, but that haven't. And you're asking them to be the same, or you're asking them to be competitive. Like that just would never, if we were just comparing two male drivers and saying this person, I mean, we get it all the time, right? Pay drivers tend to get far and are semi-decent at least because they can afford to have that seat time, to have that those private tests, to get the sponsors, to pay for the seats. Like it is still at the end of the day, it's a sport driven by money. And the conversations that I've had, so Chris and I were lucky enough to go out to the States in the summer, and we went to the Skip Barber Racing School, and we did a 3-day Formula 4 test, both him and I. And there were certain things that kind of popped up for me that weren't the same for you.
On arrival, for starters.
So, you know, when we arrived, there was a group of about 12 of us, was there? About 12, maybe more. Of students who were going to be taking part in the same test. There was one other woman, and she was just there for a jolly, really. Like she wasn't, it was a bit of fun for 3 days or whatever. And when I turned up to the registration desk, the girl behind the desk was like, "Oh, and are you watching?"
Oh.
Like, no, I'm here to take part. And as soon as I said that, she was like, "Oh God, amazing, right? Okay." Like, but it was the assumption was, "Oh, I'm here to watch him."
Yeah.
And it wasn't. And there was stuff like they didn't have kit small enough for me, so my helmet was too big. So when we got up to like pushing top, well, we were limited in the cars, but when we were pushing like top speed, my helmet was lifting. Like when we were going down the straights, like, and that's so distracting because you're all of a sudden you're not focusing on where's my braking point. You're focusing on, is my helmet gonna come off?
Yeah.
So there was stuff like that. You know, they didn't have any racing boots small enough for me. We just about got a race suit small enough for me. Obviously, the cockpit in the car, these are all stock Formula 4 cars. I had to have special padding put in. I mean, some of the other guys did too, but I had to have a lot because my legs were too short and my hips were too big. So I was kind of rattling around the cockpit in one way and then stuck and quite uncomfortable in others. So it was, even that was, you know, a 3-day experience, but even then it was like, this isn't built for me. I don't belong here.
To your point about going further back, you know, even when I look at the karting events that we do, so we have a lot of girls that come to the karting events and they need the back support, the seat inserts. Even with the seat inserts, that doesn't do the job. Some of them are still struggling to reach the pedals. And as you say, they're walking around these baggy old race suits because they're all designed for blokes. The helmets don't fit. and
Yeah.
and that's at karting level, that, and
Yeah.
corporate karting, so it's a huge task, isn't it?
Like,
And
I'm
so-
sorry, if Alpine can develop a car that works with Esteban Ocon, who's about 17 foot tall, and Fernando Alonso, who's like the next tiniest to Yuki Tsunoda, there is not an excuse. I'm sorry.
Well, you're right. That's the thing. There isn't an excuse, but the people don't look at it, and then they go, as Jess was saying about where money's involved or needed to get people through. I know some people then level the argument like, well, if someone would just put all the money behind one female driver, or sorry, basically one girl who hasn't even been karting yet, and says, get in a go-kart, we'll give you all the time in the world, and with time and experience, you'll get good. But it's like, but no one will do that, because they know all the way along that road towards whichever pinnacle that you want to target, there are obstacles that are unfairly slanted against women. And as you've just said about the way that certain things don't fit, or the gear that they've got, or the car just not being quite suited to them in terms of, some of the power steering stuff, which you don't need by the time you reach Formula One. Like, it's pointless, but it's a roadblock on the way. And Anthony Davidson, I did a podcast with him on Motorsport magazine, he really explained it well. He said he felt disadvantaged getting into a Formula One car back in the mid 2000s, because he knew he was quicker, like it's on skill, than most of the drivers that he'd been competing with. But physically, with his size, because he was small and he wasn't like bulky up top, he was fatiguing towards the end of races, and he retired from a few where he made mistakes and crashed out, or genuinely just had to almost park it. And he said he felt like it shouldn't be that way. Like, it shouldn't come down to how much can I lift in the gym. It's how can I basically find the quickest way around a racetrack. They're two different things. And he says if he had it on his level, he can't imagine what it's like for a lot of women. And so you're not going to get people put all the money behind them and give them those opportunities, because they know, in a sense, it's not sensible money if you've got 2% less chance, because they all add up as small things. But that's a gamble that then you put the money behind a guy because he's got 2% more chance. That's why it happens that way.
It's go on, Tom.
This is why you can't measure the success or failure of something like W Series on whether they got a driver to F1. It's the unknown effect. In 10 years' time, is there's going to be a young girl coming up who watched W Series and that was the route in it. It's changing the attitudes, isn't it? It's like your experience, Jess, turning up to that event. That it's not even a malicious thing. It's just this expectation that, it's motorsport, so it's going to be predominantly male. In terms of like other, I don't know, like nursing, for example, when it's when the nurse isn't a woman, you would say a male nurse, because there's expectation, and it's not necessarily it's not born of individual malice necessarily. Sometimes it is, don't get me wrong, but I just think it's this expectation that needs to change. And it's like you get to a stage where, at the MotorMouth karting event, so the team I was on, where we got third place, was I was the only male on the team. And I was chatting to the girls there, and they were saying that, I think it's between 90 or 95%. I think it's more like 95% of racing licenses are held by males. Mm-hmm. And it's like, when you've got such a smaller pool, and you've got this assumption that if you're of a certain gender, you're going to be either into motorsport or not, that will only change over time. There's not that, like you say, like a quick one-off solution.
Even now, so I got asked by a pretty high-profile person in Formula One at Abu Dhabi, so are you actually into motorsport? Like, when did you get into it? And it's like, no guy would have that asked of them. Maybe it would
never.
Maybe it would be because I love people's Genesis stories, because I actually think it's really cool. And you will find, like, usually there's a story about a family member or a friend or something is quite like, there's a very origin stories of how people got into motorsport tend to be really lovely stories. And so I don't mind talking about that, but you know that it's not being asked. And actually they prefaced it with, "Can I ask you a rude question?"
Oh God!
But and you're like,
Jess, this is the tip of the iceberg for women in motorsport, because so this is an area we're going to be, as a podcast, we're focusing on quite a lot over the next few weeks. The reason being, and Tom will be bored of me talking about this, but we had Ariana Bravo on the show a few weeks ago, and much like we've done in this conversation, we were talking about quote females, and we were having a conversation, and then I got called out on Twitter for using the word female. So there's this whole other part of it about, how we describe people and their genders, and what words are derogatory and what words are not. And so we're going to be getting really deep into these subjects around not just women in motorsport, but how people talk about women in motorsport. So that's one part of it. And should we be referencing them as females or women or something else entirely? But there's also pieces around not just, guys coming up to you in the paddock and being like, come on, are you really interested in motorsport, Jess? What's this? But it goes well beyond that into, women and girls that work, whether they're, PRs in marketing, they're engineers, whatever position they are in the paddock, they're getting abuse in some cases. And it could be verbal, it could be something else, but there are real problems that need to be addressed. And I've spoken to someone who's been in motorsport for 20 years, very recently, a woman, and she says it's still going on. She's like, the stuff I could tell you about people who are big in motorsport who really shouldn't be doing certain things. So there's a lot, it's such a complicated subject, and we could go on for hours and hours and hours.